I want to begin with a moment that happened 11 months after everything fell apart and started over again. It was Thanksgiving evening, and the rain was coming down soft and steady, the way it does in Atlanta in late November. Not dramatic, just persistent, the kind of rain that makes the air smell like wet concrete and pine. I was standing at the front door of our house, and I watched my husband walk through that rain to the passenger side of his mother-in-law's car. He had an umbrella in his hand. He did not put it over his own head. He opened the car door, held the umbrella over Vivian so she could step out without getting wet, and he kept it there angled away from himself while she gathered her things. By the time they reached the porch, his jacket was spotted with rain across both shoulders. He had not told me he was going to do that. I had not asked him to. There was no occasion for it, no reason tied to guilt or performance or wanting to be seen doing the right thing. Vivian said thank you in her quiet way, and Garrett said of course, and then he held the door open and they came inside, and that was the whole of it. I stood in the hallway and I felt something I did not have a clean word for. It was not happiness exactly, though there was happiness in it. It was closer to relief that had been aging for a long time, the kind that only arrives after you have accepted that it might not come at all. And I thought if you saw only this moment, you would think he had always been this man. He had not always been this man. To understand how that Thanksgiving evening became possible, you need to understand what the 2 years before it looked like. You need to understand the specific architecture of my husband's blind spot. Because without that understanding, what happened at my cousin Loretta's birthday party looks like a story about one bad night and one embarrassed man. With that understanding, it looks like something more complicated and more honest than that. It looks like a long, quiet failure of curiosity that was finally in front of 40 people named. So let me give you the architecture. Garrett Weston was 38 years old when this story reaches its turning point. He was a senior project manager at Meridian Consulting Group, a firm based out of Atlanta with offices in Charlotte and Nashville, the kind of company that handled operational strategy for mid-sized corporations going through transitions, restructurings, technology integrations, supply chain realignments, work that required precision and follow-through, and the specific ability to hold a complex system in your head while managing the people inside it. Garrett was genuinely good at this. I want to be clear about that because the story requires it and because he deserves it. He was not the kind of person who performed competence. He built it. He had spent 15 years in the field before making senior PM, had managed accounts in 4 different industries, had a track record that was measurable and real. 3 of his major accounts had delivery rates above 90% over a 2-year period. His supervisors trusted him. His clients returned to him. His colleagues respected him, even the ones who competed with him. The problem, as best I can describe it, was not that Garrett had too high an opinion of himself. The problem was that his legitimate competence had over time become a kind of closed system. He had achieved enough to stop questioning the edges of what he knew. He had been right about enough things in his professional life that the habit of being right had gradually extended itself beyond the professional into the personal, into the social, into the way he read people and filed them and moved on. He believed, without ever stating it this way, that a person's significance announced itself. That expertise had a texture you could recognize, a way of occupying a room, a vocabulary, a bearing. He believed that quiet people in modest circumstances were most likely modest people with modest histories, not unintelligent, not unworthy, just smaller in the way that most people were smaller than the particular version of larger that he had built his life around. He had never examined these beliefs. That is the most accurate thing I can say about them. They were not convictions he had tested and confirmed. They were the sediment of 1,000 small social transactions over 2 decades, the automatic sorting that happens when a person stops asking whether their categories are right and starts simply applying them. He had applied them to my mother the first year we were married. He had never revisited them. Before I tell you what that cost him, let me tell you about a man named Sterling. Sterling worked at Meridian. He was 40, same general generation as Garrett, hired 3 years before Garrett made senior PM. He was good at his job in a different way than Garrett, less focused on delivery metrics, more interested in the wider context of any given account. He asked questions that were sometimes adjacent to the work questions about who owned the companies they were consulting for, what those ownership structures looked like, whether the people at the top of the organizational chart had strategic interests that the operational team should understand. He read financial disclosures on his own time. He tracked ownership changes in the firms that Meridian worked with. He had, from where Garrett stood, a habit of spreading his attention in ways that did not always seem productive. Garrett had a word for this in his own private thinking. He called it unfocused. He thought Sterling was the kind of person who could not stay in his lane, who blurred the boundaries between the work that was his responsibility and the larger picture that was not. He was not unkind to Sterling. He was collegial, professional, appropriately friendly. But in the hierarchy that Garrett carried in his head, a hierarchy built on measurable output and specialized expertise, Sterling ranked below him. Not by much, but reliably. 6 months before Loretta's birthday party, they were both in a conference room going over client documentation. Sterling looked up from his papers and said in the offhand tone of someone raising something he had been turning over for a while, "Have you ever looked into Caldwell Strategic? I keep seeing their name come up in our ownership documentation. They hold the parent company, I think. Seems worth knowing more about." Garrett did not look up from his own papers. Private equity structures are not our concern unless we are in a direct deal with them. We manage delivery, not ownership. That is why they hired us. Sterling did not push. He had a way of knowing when a door had closed. He looked back at his own papers and the conversation ended. That was the only time in the 5 years Garrett had been at Meridian that anyone put the truth directly in front of him and gave him the chance to walk toward it. He walked past it without looking up. I did not know about this specific conversation until much later, but I tell you about it now because it matters for everything that follows. The information Garrett needed was not hidden from him. It was not locked away in a place he could not reach. It was offered to him casually in a conference room by a colleague he had silently underestimated, and he declined it because it did not fit the category he had already assigned to that kind of question. That is the architecture of a blind spot. It is not the absence of information. It is the construction of a system that makes the information invisible before it can be seen. Now let me give you my mother. Vivian Caldwell was 62 years old. She stood 5 feet 2 inches in flat shoes, which was how she always dressed, and she had the kind of face that had always looked somewhat older than its age when she was young, and now looked exactly its age, which is to say it looked like a face that had thought a great many things over a great many years and had arrived at a particular settled quality because of it. Her hair was natural silver streak kept in a low bun that she maintained with the same unhurried consistency she brought to most things. She drove a Buick LeSabre from 2008. She had owned it for 11 years. When people who knew her well asked why she did not replace it, she said she liked the way it sat on the road. Not the way a person says something to avoid conversation, but the way a person says something that is simply factually true. She liked it. That was enough. She wore modest clothes, not because she could not afford otherwise, because comfort had always mattered to her more than display, and because she had learned early what happened when a Black woman made her resources visible in certain rooms. I want to explain that lesson the right way because it shaped everything she did and did not do for decades. In the early 2000s, when she was building what would become Caldwell Strategic Holdings, she attended a networking event in Atlanta for private equity professionals. She was one of a small number of Black women in the room, and she was among the more accomplished people present, though no one in that room knew that. Midway through the evening, a man who had graduated from one of the Ivy League business schools and had been in the industry for 30 years sat down next to her after learning her name was connected to a real estate transaction he had read about. They talked for 40 minutes. He did most of the talking. At the end of the conversation, he proposed a partnership in a tone that suggested he was offering her an opportunity without once asking what she was looking for or what she was building. He had decided within the first 5 minutes what kind of person she was. And the conversation had been his way of fitting her into the space he had already designed. She went home that night and thought about it carefully. She was not angry. She was clear. She understood that visible wealth in a Black woman drew a specific quality of attention that was more interested in extracting than celebrating. She understood that the most powerful position in any room was the position that others had not yet calculated. And she decided with the practical resolve that had guided every significant decision of her life to keep her life small on the surface and enormous underneath. This was not a disguise, it was a choice. The Buick was not a prop. She liked it. The modest clothes were not armor. She was comfortable in them. The dish she brought to every family gathering, the one she had been making since she was 25, was not performance. She had been raised to contribute, and she had never outgrown the instinct. What she had also never outgrown was the habit of watching. She grew up watching her parents work with the kind of exhaustion that comes from giving everything and receiving a fraction of what is fair in return. She decided at 12 years old that she would not replicate that equation, not from bitterness, from clarity. The difference between bitterness and clarity is that bitterness narrows and clarity opens, and everything Vivian did with her life was about opening. She worked through community college in Cleveland, then transferred for a 4-year degree in business administration, then spent a decade in corporate finance at firms that did not fully know what to do with her, but were willing to use what she knew. She treated those 10 years as tuition. She saved with a discipline that would have impressed people who saw her numbers. She studied markets with the patience of someone who understood that the people who won over time were not the ones who moved fastest, but the ones who understood the most. She made her first real estate acquisition at 31, her first business acquisition at 37. By the time I was in college, she controlled interests in 4 industries. She told almost nobody. Specifically, she told almost nobody outside of the people who needed to know to do the work. I knew the shape of it. Her closest friend of 30 years knew. Her attorney and her accountant knew. Her inner circle was small and intentional and built on a foundation of proven judgment. Caldwell Strategic Holdings, by the time this story takes place, had interests in 17 companies across 5 industries. One of those companies was Meridian Consulting Group. Meridian had joined the Caldwell portfolio 11 years before the birthday party. She had owned it for longer than Garrett had been working in his industry. She had reviewed its operational structure. When it came into the portfolio, had read the names of its senior staff in the documentation and had made the practical decision to leave the existing management largely in place because the results warranted it. She saw Garrett Weston's name in that documentation 4 years before the birthday party, which was also 8 months before he became my husband. She did not call me when she saw it. She did not mention it when I introduced him to her. She sat across the table at our rehearsal dinner and passed the bread basket and asked him genuine questions about what he enjoyed about his work, and she listened to his answers with the full attention that she brought to everything, and she watched. I knew she had seen his name in the records. She told me quietly in my kitchen the week before the wedding, and she said, "I want to see who he is when nobody has told him who I am." I understood that. I also understood, standing in my kitchen with 4 days until my wedding, that I was now holding a piece of information that created a kind of test I had not designed and had not agreed to. My husband-to-be was going to work every weekday for a company owned by my mother. He did not know this. She did not intend to tell him. And I, for reasons I examined imperfectly over the years that followed, did not tell him either. I told myself I was waiting to see whether he would ask. I told myself that if he had any real curiosity about the people in his life, he would eventually wonder about my mother's work, would eventually ask a question that led somewhere real. I told myself this was reasonable. The part of that story I am less proud of is the other part. The part where I recognized in a place I did not examine too closely that if Garrett never asked, I would eventually have to face what that meant. I was not entirely sure I was ready to face it, and so I waited. That is my portion of what happened. I am not offering it as an excuse. I am offering it because the story requires accuracy, and accuracy means including the parts that do not reflect well. In the first year of our marriage, Garrett decided who my mother was. He did not announce this decision. He would not have framed it as a decision at all. It was a sorting, a filing, the kind of unconscious categorization that happens when a person applies a working theory to a new piece of information. His working theory was about the relationship between a person's manner and their significance. Vivian's manner was warm, quiet, unhurried, and free of any of the signals he associated with professional accomplishment. Therefore, she was warm, quiet, unhurried, and professionally modest. He was never unkind to her. That is important, and I want to say it plainly. He was consistently, reliably, genuinely kind in the ways that a man is kind to his wife's mother when he has decided she is a sweet woman who loves her daughter. He asked about her health. He thanked her for the food she brought. He carried things in from her car when she visited. He performed every courtesy correctly. What he did not do in 5 years of marriage was ask her a single question about her work. Not one. He did not ask what she had done before retirement, which he assumed was something modest and service-oriented. He did not ask about the organizations she was involved with. He did not ask what she was interested in professionally or intellectually in any way that went beyond the surface of a polite family gathering. I tested this once. In the second year of our marriage at Christmas, Vivian asked him a question about a regulatory shift in an industry segment that Meridian had been working in. The question was precise and technically informed in a way that only someone who had read the relevant filings would recognize. Garrett answered it correctly but briefly and then redirected the conversation towards something else. On the drive home, I said, "That was a sharp question she asked." He said, "I think she read something somewhere. She was following along fine." He meant it kindly. He was not dismissing her with contempt. He was placing her in a category as gently as he knew how, and the category had a ceiling she could not see from where he was standing. I knew the question had not come from an article. I knew because I had been on the phone with my mother 3 days earlier, and she had been reviewing an internal financial summary of Meridian's operations while we talked, and the question she asked Garrett at Christmas had come directly from what she had been reading. I said nothing. That is my portion again. I said nothing. There is one more thing you need to know before this story reaches the birthday party. And this is the piece that surprised me most when I learned it later. Sterling, the colleague Garrett had quietly underestimated, had applied for a position at a company within the Caldwell strategic portfolio 6 months before Loretta turned 40, not at Meridian, at a different company in the holdings, a firm in a different city that was expanding its operational leadership. He had passed 2 rounds of interviews. The people who ran those interviews reported back to Vivian's office. I knew about this because Nia, who handled logistics for my mother, mentioned it in passing during a call I happened to be on. She had not intended to reveal anything significant. She was giving my mother a status update on several concurrent hiring conversations, and Sterling's name came up as one of them. I did not tell Garrett. I want to be precise about why. It was not strategic. It was not calculated. It was the quiet, complicated recognition that this information, like the rest of it, pointed to a question I was not sure I wanted to force before it was ready to be asked. Garrett had built a professional hierarchy in his mind in which Sterling stood at a particular level. Sterling had apparently been quietly doing the work of understanding the wider context that Garrett had dismissed as irrelevant. That fact meant something, and I did not want to much the person who handed it to Garrett rather than waiting to see whether he would earn it. So that is the full shape of what existed before the birthday party. My mother had owned the parent company of my husband's employer for 11 years. He had been working for her without knowing it for 4. She had been watching him for 3. She had watched how he spoke about his industry, how he related to the people around him, whether he ever became curious about the things that were not immediately visibly impressive. She had reached a conclusion she had not shared with me. She did not need to share it with me. The birthday party would share it for her. The last thing I will tell you about the months before that night is a small thing that felt large only in retrospect. I came home one evening in September, 6 weeks before Loretta's 40th, and Garrett was at the kitchen table with his laptop working through something for one of his accounts. He looked up when I came in, and we talked about our days the way couples do, the ordinary layering of small information. At some point, he mentioned a performance review cycle coming up at Meridian, and I said something general in response, and then he said, Howard mentioned ownership might be more hands-on in this one, reviewing some structural stuff. I felt something move in my chest. I kept my expression steady. That seems unusual, I said. I guess they want to be more involved. I'm not worried about it. They hired us to do a job, and we've been doing it. He turned back to the laptop. I looked at him for a moment, the back of his head, the comfortable set of his shoulders, the specific posture of a man who is not worried because he has never been given reason to worry, and I thought he is going to be given reason very soon. I did not say that. What I said was, what do you want for dinner? And that was the last ordinary evening before Loretta's 40th birthday party, which is where the story I have been building toward finally begins. The morning of the party, Garrett took a phone call in the kitchen while I was getting dressed, and something about the way his voice changed in the middle of it made me stop moving. I could not hear the other end of the call. I heard Garrett cite the professional register he used with colleagues, measured and unhurried. I heard him say Howard's name twice. I heard him say, that level of involvement seems unusual for this cycle. And then a pause, and then, I understand, but the operational picture is solid. The numbers are going to speak for themselves. Another pause longer. Then, I appreciate the heads up. He set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment with his hand still resting on it. I came into the kitchen. He looked up at me, and his expression was the one he wore when he was processing something he had not yet decided how to frame. Howard is saying ownership wants to sit in on part of the performance review. Directly, not through a rep personally. He said this the way a person says something that does not quite fit the map they have been using. Does that concern you? I asked. No, he said too quickly. Then it is just not how these structures usually work. I poured coffee and did not say anything. He was right that it was not how these structures usually worked. He was wrong about the reason. But I had been carrying that particular wrong for 3 years, and I was not going to put it down in the kitchen at 9 in the morning before my cousin's birthday party. We should leave by 2, I said. Traffic on the connector is going to be bad. He nodded, the phone call already being filed away in the part of his mind reserved for things that did not require immediate action. That was one of the things he was genuinely good at, not carrying unnecessary weight into the next task. It was also, I had come to understand, one of the ways he avoided carrying necessary weight. We left at 2:15. The drive to Loretta's house in Decatur took 40 minutes because the connector was exactly as bad as I had predicted, and we spent most of it in the comfortable, companionable silence of two people who have been together long enough that silence does not require filling. I watched the city move past the window. Garrett drove with one hand on the wheel, his jaw set in the particular way it's set when he was present in body, but working something through in his mind. I thought about the phone call. I thought about Howard's voice saying ownership might be more directly involved. I thought about my mother, who was probably already at Loretta's house, having arrived early, with 2 dishes covered in foil and a set of serving utensils in a cloth bag. I did not say any of this. Loretta lived in a house that had been built for exactly the kind of gathering she threw. Wide rooms, a back porch that could hold 20 people, a kitchen designed by someone who understood that cooking and company were not separate activities. She had bought it 6 years earlier with her husband Darnell and had spent every year since filling it with the specific warmth of a woman who knew how to make a space feel like everyone in it had been expected. The party was already full when we arrived. 40-some people, give or take, spread across the ground floor and the back porch. 3 generations of family. The smell of food layered over itself, collard greens and roasted chicken, and something sweet from the oven I could not immediately identify. 7 conversations happening at the same volume in different corners of the house. Children running through the spaces between adults. Music from somewhere I could not see, old school R&B, at a volume designed for background rather than dancing. I loved this. I had loved this my entire life. The particular texture of a large Black family gathering, the way it absorbed you the moment you walked through the door and made it impossible to feel separate from anything. I felt my shoulders drop in a way I had not realized they were raised. Garrett touched my lower back briefly as we came through the door, a practiced gesture, the acknowledgement of arrival. He was wearing the expression I recognized as his social face, pleasant and attentive, and a half-step removed from full presence. He was here. He would be here for the duration. He understood that marriage required showing up for the things that mattered to the person you had married. He simply had not yet learned to want to show up for this in the way I wanted him to want it. I did not spend energy on that. It was Loretta's day, and I was not going to spend it managing the distance between where Garrett was and where I wished he were. I found Loretta in the living room, resplendent in a burnt orange wrap dress, holding a glass of something sparkling and laughing at something her sister had just said. I hugged her and told her she looked extraordinary, which was true, and she said 40 felt different than she expected, which was also probably true. Garrett shook Darnell's hand and they fell into the easy conversation of men who do not know each other well, but are both intelligent enough to find their way to a topic without much friction. Sports first, then, something about the Decatur restaurant scene, then the particular pleasures and disasters of home ownership. I watched them from across the room and felt the familiar, complicated tenderness of watching the person you love performing adequately in a situation they find difficult. I went to find my mother. She was not in the main rooms. She was in the kitchen, which was where she always was for the first hour of any family gathering, quietly integrating herself into whatever was already happening. I found her at the counter next to my Aunt Bernadette, Loretta's mother, 67 years old, and built like a woman who had been organizing people her entire life. They were talking in the low, unhurried way of two people who had known each other for 4 decades. My mother looked up when I came in. She smiled the smile she had always smiled when she saw me, full and genuine and entirely without performance. She was wearing a dark charcoal blouse and simple trousers, her silver-streaked hair in the low bun she had kept for 20 years. She looked exactly as she always looked, which was to say, she looked like everything she was and nothing that would tell you so. Bernadette pulled me into a hug that lasted the length of a genuine embrace rather than a polite one. She smelled like the perfume she had worn since I was a child. She held me by both arms and looked at me and said, "You look tired." "I'm fine," I said, which was true in most of the ways that mattered. She turned back to whatever she had been doing on the counter, which appeared to be organizing serving spoons by size. Bernadette organized things when she was thinking. It was one of her tells. My mother was watching me with the specific calibrated attention she had been giving me my entire life. The attention that did not press but also did not miss anything. "Loretta looks wonderful," I said, taking a position at the counter and picking up a dish towel because there was always something to dry in any kitchen Bernadette had organized. "She does," my mother agreed. "She asked me," Bernadette said without looking up from the spoons, "when your mama was going to retire." A pause. Your mama laughed and didn't answer. There was something in the way she said it. Not accusation, not amusement, something more considered than either. I looked at my mother. She was rinsing something at the sink, her back partly to me. Bernadette set down a spoon and turned to face me, and her expression had shifted into the territory of things she had decided needed saying. "Your husband," she said, "he never asks about your mama." It was not a question. I knew it was not a question. "No," I said. Bernadette nodded slow and even. "I have known Vivian for 40 years, known what she built for 15 of them. That is not my business to tell." She picked up another spoon. "But there comes a time when a thing that has been quiet for long enough needs to be said. Not by me, not by you." She glanced at my mother's back. "By the situation." I felt something settle in my chest, not alarm, something more like the recognition of inevitability. My mother turned off the tap and dried her hands on a kitchen towel. She did not turn around immediately. When she did, her face was exactly what it always was, composed, warm, entirely in possession of itself. But her eyes were doing something specific that I had learned to read over 35 years. They were the eyes of a woman who had already made a decision and was carrying it with the particular lightness of a person who has put down something heavy by committing to it. "Go enjoy the party," she said to me. "I'll be out in a few minutes." I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. I did not know in that moment that my mother had already decided. I suspected it. Bernadette had confirmed something I had been sensing for weeks. But I did not know the form it would take or the timing, and there are things you cannot prepare for even when you know they are coming. I went to find Garrett. He was in the living room, standing near the windows with a glass of wine in his hand, talking with a man I recognized from a previous party as Jerome, who lived 2 houses down from Loretta and Darnell. Jerome was tall, broadly built, a contractor who had done some work on Loretta's back porch and had been invited to the birthday party in the easy, generous way that Loretta invited everyone she liked. He was a good talker, Jerome. He had the quality of making the person across from him feel that the conversation was specifically interesting to him, which I suspected it usually was. They were talking about work. I could tell from Garrett's posture before I was close enough to hear the words. He had a particular way of standing when he was in professional territory, a slight forward lean, a specificity in the hands, the bearing of a man who is fully at home. I got myself a drink from the side table and moved to the edge of the room, not toward them, but not away. I could hear the conversation now. Garrett was talking about his industry, about consulting, about the particular skills required to manage operational complexity in companies going through transition. He was good at this. He was articulate and concrete and had the easy authority of someone who has explained something many times and refined the explanation over years. Jerome was listening the way he listened to things, with full and genuine attention. He asked a question about how the consulting firms themselves were structured, about what the chain of accountability looked like when something went wrong. Garrett answered smoothly. He talked about the relationship between the management layer and the client, about how the real value in any engagement came from the professionals who understood the operations. And then my mother came out of the kitchen. She moved the way she always moved through a crowded room, quietly and without urgency, exchanging a few words with people as she passed a hand on an arm here, a smile there. She had a glass of sweet tea. She was making her way, without appearing to be making her way anywhere, toward the edge of the cluster of people standing near Garrett and Jerome. I watched her settle into a position at the rim of the group, 3 feet from Garrett to his left, slightly behind him. He registered her presence with a slight adjustment of his head, not a look, just the peripheral awareness of someone entering your field. He did not change his expression or his posture in any meaningful way. She was in the category his mind had built for her, simply present. Jerome, still curious, said, "What about the ownership level? Do they not set the direction? I would think whoever owns the firm has a view on how things are supposed to go." Garrett smiled. I knew that smile. It was the smile he wore when a question had a neat, satisfying answer that he had given before. Ownership without operational expertise is usually just capital looking for somewhere to sit, he said. The people who actually run these things are the people who studied the work, who came up through it. The owners are usually very much background. They hire the management layer because they know what they don't know. That is how it is supposed to work. He made a small gesture with his wine glass. The gesture was casual, and it was large, an arc that took in the general space around him. My mother was standing inside that arc. She heard every word. I watched her face. It did not change in any way that Jerome or Garrett or anyone else in the room would have noticed. But I noticed because I had been reading her face since I was old enough to read anything. There was a shift in the quality of her stillness. Something had settled, something that had been waiting patiently had found its place. She had the small smile I knew. It was not an amused smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just received the last piece of information she needed to complete a picture she had been building for 3 years. I was standing in the doorway that connected the living room to the hallway, and I felt cold in the specific way you feel cold when you are watching something you cannot stop and you are not certain you should stop it, even if you could. My mother reached out and set her sweet tea glass on the side table to her left. She did it slowly and carefully, the way you set something down when you want your hands to be free. Then she turned to face Garrett with the full, warm expression she had worn for every conversation she had ever had with him. "That is a really interesting perspective," she said. "What firm do you work for?" Garrett turned to her with the pleasant attention he always gave her. "Meridian Consulting Group. We are based here in Atlanta, offices in Charlotte and Nashville." "And what do you do there?" "Senior Project Manager. Coming up on 5 years now. I run the operational delivery side for 3 of our major accounts." "That is impressive," she said. She meant it. I could tell she meant it, Even in this moment, perhaps especially in this moment, she was not performing generosity. She was genuinely capable of recognizing competence even while doing what she was doing. Do you know who owns the firm? Garrett smiled in the way people smile when they think a question is simple. It is part of a holding company, Caldwell Strategic Holdings, I believe, private equity structure. I have never actually met anyone from the ownership side. They are, as I said, very much background. The people running the day-to-day are the management team. That is how those arrangements tend to work. He had used his own word back at himself. He did not know it yet. My mother nodded. She looked at him for a moment with the unhurried attention that was. I understood then the attention of a woman who had been patient for a very long time and had decided she was finished being patient. I am Vivian, she said, Vivian Caldwell. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. I do not know why I counted, only that I did, and that each of those 4 seconds had a weight and a texture I could feel from across the room. Garrett's face moved through stages I watched with the precision of someone who has studied a face for years. The first stage was ordinary. He was processing a name the way you process any name someone introduces themselves with, running it through the social context of the room. The second stage was the beginning of something else, a small crease between his brows, a micro shift in his eyes as a connection started to form. The third stage was the connection forming fully, the specific recalibration of understanding what the connection meant. And the fourth stage was unlike anything I had seen on his face before. It was stillness, not the stillness of composure, the stillness of a man who has walked at his normal pace and speed into a wall that he had genuinely believed was open air and is standing in the aftermath of the impact before the pain has had time to inform him of its full dimensions. My mother's voice was unchanged, warm and even, and completely in possession of itself. Caldwell Strategic Holdings is mine. I founded it 25 years ago. Meridian joined our portfolio 11 years ago. She picked up her sweet tea from the side table. She took a single unhurried sip. Then she looked at Garrett with the eyes of a woman who has said the one true thing she had been holding in reserve for 3 years. You have been working for me for 4 years, Garrett. It is very nice to finally meet you properly. Jerome made a sound. It was involuntary. Not laughter, something the body produces when a fact lands on it before the mind has had time to prepare a more dignified response. The cluster of people who had been in earshot had stopped their other conversations. Sound travels differently in houses full of family. People had heard. And the specific intelligence of the room, the quality of attention that a large family gathering brings to a significant moment, registered what had just happened with the precision of people who understood they were witnessing something they would be thinking about for a long time. My cousin Loretta, who had been standing 10 feet away and had heard everything, turned to look at my mother with an expression that carried equal amounts of deep admiration and the particular satisfaction of someone who has suspected something for 20 years and has just had it confirmed in a way beyond anything they imagined. Bernadette, standing near the entrance to the kitchen with her own glass, looked down at it, not to avoid the moment, to give it the respect of not commenting on it. She was a woman who understood that some moments belonged to the people inside them. Garrett said, Vivienne, why, and stopped. 2 words. He could not find the rest. She raised one hand, not dramatically, simply the way you raise a hand to gently close a door that has been left open. It is a birthday party, she said. Let us enjoy it. And she turned with the unhurried ease of a woman going to wish her niece a happy birthday and walked away. He watched her go. Then he turned and found me in the doorway. I was still standing where I had been standing for the last several minutes. I had not moved. I looked back at him across the room, and I had nothing to say that the moment had not already said better and more completely than I could. The rest of the party happened the way the rest of parties happen after something seismic. Life continued on the surface. People ate and laughed, and the children kept running and the music kept playing, and Loretta blew out her candles and people sang to her. My mother was exactly who she had always been for the remaining 2 hours, the person in the kitchen, helping with whatever needed helping, the person asking about someone's mother's health, the person who laughed at the right moments for real reasons. She did not mention what had happened. She did not reference it in her posture or her expression. She gave it no weight in public beyond the weight it had already earned. She was the most gracious person in the room. She had always been the most gracious person in the room. Garrett understood now what that grace was built on. He was careful for the rest of the evening. He did not retreat to a corner. He did not leave early. He stayed, spoke when spoken to, was present in the ways he was capable of being present. It was the most I had ever seen him do with discomfort without trying to manage it into something else. He sat with it. And that, I thought, watching him from across the room, was a small thing that was not small at all. We said our goodbyes at 9. Loretta hugged me for a long time and said nothing specific into my shoulder. My mother kissed my cheek at the door, squeezed my hand once, and went to find Bernadette. Garrett shook Darnell's hand and thanked him with the sincerity of a man who genuinely meant thank you, and was aware it carried more weight than the words alone. We got in the car. Garrett drove. I watched the road. Neither of us spoke. I watched the clock on the dashboard. 7 minutes. 8. The city moved past the windows in the particular way Atlanta looks at night. When you are inside your own thoughts, the lights blurred, and the streets sequential, and the whole of it at one, removed from wherever you actually are. At 11 minutes, Garrett said, "I did not know." He said it the way a person says something they are placing on a table rather than offering as a defense. A fact, here it is, let us both look at it, look at. "I know you did not," I said. He drove, a full minute. "Why did you not tell me?" I had been waiting for this question. Not in the way you wait for something you are dreading, but in the way you wait for something you have prepared for so long that the preparation is its own kind of readiness. "Because you never asked," I said. "In 5 years, Garrett, you have never once asked me about my mother's work, not what she did before she retired, not what she was interested in, not who she had been before you knew her. You decided who she was in the first year, and you did not revisit it." I kept my voice even. This was not anger, it was a ledger being read aloud. You are not incurious about the world. You are genuinely curious about many things. But you were not curious about her specifically because you had placed her in a category that did not require curiosity. He did not say anything immediately. He drove. His hands on the wheel were steady. "She's been watching you for 3 years," I said. "She watched how you spoke to her. She watched how you spoke about your work. She watched whether you would ever become curious about the people around you who did not immediately signal their own importance." What did she decide? I turned to look at him. He was a genuinely intelligent man. He deserved the honest answer. "That you are talented at your work," I said, "and that the talent had made you comfortable enough that you stopped looking past what was immediately in front of you." He took a breath. Then he said, "Do you agree with her?" This was the question I had not prepared for. Not because it surprised me, but because I had spent 3 years not asking it of myself in terms clear enough to answer out loud. "In part," I said. He waited. He knew there was more. "The part I am least comfortable with," I said slowly, "is my own part. I told myself I was waiting to see whether you would ask. And that was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I was not entirely ready to face what it would mean if you never did." I looked at the road. I am not offering that as an excuse. I am offering it because you asked an honest question and it deserves an honest answer. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. It was not the silence of two people avoiding something. It was the silence of two people who have just handed each other something true and are figuring out what to do with it. What do I do? He said. The question was quiet and without decoration. No frame around it, no hedge, no conditional, just the question. That is the right question, I said. You are about 3 years late asking it, but it is the right question. He drove. Outside the car, Atlanta settled into its nighttime rhythms, the highway thinning as we got farther from the center, the neighborhoods coming back the particular quality of quiet that an October night in Georgia has when the heat has finally broken and the air knows it. I thought about the morning. I thought about Howard's call, the ownership review, the moment Garrett had processed it and filed it away. I thought about Sterling in that conference room 6 months ago, the casual offer of a truth that had been declined without looking up. I thought about my mother standing 3 feet behind Garrett with a glass of sweet tea and the specific stillness of a woman who has made a decision. I thought about the question Garrett had just asked, the right question 3 years late. The thing about smart people I have learned is that intelligence does not protect you from shame. It only multiplies the routes available for responding to it. A smart person who has done something wrong has more sophisticated ways to rationalize, to redirect, to transform discomfort into something more manageable. Most of those routes lead nowhere useful. A few of them, if the person chooses carefully, lead somewhere real. I did not know that night in the car which route Garrett would choose. He was a man who had built his life on being right, on the measurable satisfaction of doing things well and being recognized for it. What had just happened at Loretta's birthday party was not a professional failure. It was not something he could solve with better data or a revised delivery schedule. It was the exposure of something he had carried for years without knowing it was there. People can respond to that kind of exposure in several ways. I had seen smart people respond to it by reframing the exposure as someone else's fault. I had seen them respond by minimizing what had been revealed. I had seen them respond by performing change without making it, which is its own form of sophistication. I watched the road and I did not know yet which kind of person I was sitting next to. The man who had asked the right question was the same man who had stood in a room 40 minutes ago and said that ownership without expertise was just capital, looking for a place to sit 3 feet from the woman who had spent 25 years building something that would outlast most of the organizations he had ever consulted for. Those two things were both true at the same time. That is what made the next days matter. He called her on Monday morning. I did not ask him to. I did not suggest. It did not leave the idea anywhere he might find it. I woke up at 6:30 and he was already in the kitchen with coffee, his phone on the table in front of him. And when I came in, he looked up at me with the expression of a man who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to execute it. I am going to call her, he said. All right, I said. I poured coffee and went to the other end of the house. Not to give him privacy, exactly, more to give the moment its proper dimensions. The space a significant thing deserves when it is happening. I heard his voice from the hallway, not the words, just the register. It was different from his professional register and different from his social register. It was quieter and more careful than either the voice of a person choosing each word before they say it, because they understand that the wrong word is worse than silence. He was on the phone for 18 minutes. When I came back to the kitchen, he was sitting with both hands around his mug and the particular stillness of someone who has put something heavy down and is not yet sure what their body feels like without the weight. I told her, he said, That what I said at the party was not a reflection of how I think about people who have built something real. That it was a reflection of assumptions I had not examined. I told her I was sorry for the specific things I said in front of people and for the general way I had related to her for 3 years. What did she say? He looked at his mug. She said she had never been offended by my dismissiveness. She said she'd been disappointed by it and that disappointed was the more accurate word. He paused. She said she had hoped for your sake that I would have more curiosity, that she kept expecting me to ask. He looked up at me then, and his eyes had the quality of a person who has heard something true about himself from someone with the authority to say it and has not looked away from it. Disappointed, he said again. Blam, not to me, to himself, testing the word against the thing it described. I did not say anything. There was nothing to add. My mother had said the most honest thing she had ever communicated to him and possibly to me, and the word did not need company. He went to work that day. He came home at 6, made dinner without explaining why, and we ate and talked about ordinary things. I noticed that he listened differently that evening with a quality of attention that was more complete than his usual attention, as if he had recalibrated the sensitivity on something internal and was still adjusting to the new setting. I noticed it. I did not say I noticed it. Some things need room to develop without being observed. 2 days later, he told me he had spoken to Howard. Howard Greer was 50 years old, department head at Meridian, the man who had managed Garrett's career trajectory for 4 of the 5 years Garrett had been at the firm. He was a careful, methodical person with 30 years in the industry and the specific intelligence of someone who had survived multiple market cycles by understanding context rather than just execution. Garrett respected him. They had a functional professional relationship built on consistent results and mutual pragmatism. Garrett had gone to Howard not to manage the situation, which is what most people would have done with the information now in his possession. He had gone because he had decided that if he was going to operate inside a structure he had fundamentally misunderstood, he needed to understand it properly. That distinction matters. He was not doing damage control, he was doing something harder. I told him about the party, Garrett said. I told him what happened, what Vivian said, what I had said before she said it. He was at the kitchen table again. It had become the location of these conversations, the place where the serious things got laid out, as if the table itself had acquired a function. What did he say? He said Vivian Caldwell is one of the sharpest people he has dealt with in 30 years of business. He said he would recommend learning everything she is willing to teach. A pause. And then I asked him how long he had known. I looked at him. What did he say? He said before I joined the company. Garrett held my gaze. He knew before I ever walked in the door. I absorbed this. I had not known that Howard knew. My mother had not mentioned it. I told him he should have said something, Garrett said. He told me it was not his place to say. He said he had been waiting to see if I would ask. Something moved across his face. That is the third person in this story who was waiting for me to ask. What did you say to that? I said maybe he should have told me anyway. He was quiet for a moment. He said maybe I should have asked. He set his mug down. We looked at each other for a while after that. Neither of us was entirely wrong. That is a harder position to be in than one where someone is clearly right. I thought about that on my own for a long time after he said it. There is something specific about a conflict where the distribution of responsibility is real and shared, where no one gets the clean position of being entirely blameless. Those conflicts do not resolve with an apology and a lesson. They resolve over time, if they resolve at all, through behavior rather than words. Garrett went back to work the next day and the day after. He made dinner twice that week without comment. He called his mother, which he did not do often enough, and I heard him ask her how she was doing in a way that waited for an actual answer rather than moving past the question. I was watching, not suspiciously, with the specific attention of someone who has been waiting a long time to see which direction a person would move in when the ground shifted. What happened with Sterling, I did not witness directly. Garrett told me about it the following week, sitting in the kitchen, talking in the measured way. He had been talking about everything significant since the party, as if he had recalibrated not just what he said, but the pace at which he said it. He had found Sterling at the office and asked him directly about the question Sterling had raised in the conference room 6 months earlier. Why had he asked about Caldwell's strategic? What he knew. Sterling had looked at him for a moment before answering. Then he said that when he had joined Meridian, he had spent his first 2 weeks reading the ownership documentation. It was something he did with every company he worked for, understanding the full structure before he understood his specific role within it. He had seen the Caldwell name, had researched it, and had understood within a week who owned the firm he was working for. That was 3 years ago. Garrett said, "You have known for 3 years." Sterling said, "Yes." Garrett said, "And you never said anything." Sterling looked at him with the patience of a person who has thought carefully about something and is willing to say it plainly. "I mentioned it to you once. You told me it was not relevant to our work." The silence that followed, Garrett told me, was the kind of silence that has a temperature. "I also," Sterling continued without particular emphasis, "applied for a position at one of the other companies in the Caldwell portfolio 6 months ago. I got through 2 rounds." Garrett said, "I know." Sterling looked at him. "How do you know?" "Marlowe told me," Garrett said, which was true. I had told him about the application the week after the party, when I had finished sorting through the things I had been carrying that needed to be set down. She found out through Vivian's office. Sterling was quiet for a moment, then, "The position required someone who understood both the operational side and the ownership structure. Someone who asked the right questions before walking into a room." He picked up his coffee. "I thought it might be a fit." "Did you take it?" "I am still thinking." Sterling looked at him steadily. "They are restructuring some things at Meridian. I wanted to see how that landed before I decided." Garrett said, "What restructuring?" Sterling said, "That is the right question. You should ask Howard." He came home that evening and was quiet through dinner in a way that was different from the quiet of the previous days. The earlier quiet had been processing. This was something else. This was the quiet of a man who has learned in a single conversation that the colleague he had quietly placed below him on his internal hierarchy had been operating with a more complete map than he had for 3 years in the same building, had been asked the right question at the company level before he was asked the right question at home. He did not say any of this to me at dinner. He ate and he was present, and when we finished, he washed the dishes without being asked. He had started doing that in the days after the party. Not every night, but consistently enough that it was a pattern rather than an incident. 3 weeks after the birthday party, my mother called and invited us to dinner. Not a family dinner, not the kind of gathering she had always come to, the layered noise and warmth of too many people in a house built for it. A quiet dinner, the three of us at her home. The address she gave was not the address Garrett had on file for her. I had been to this house before many times. I had grown up understanding that my mother had two addresses. The modest, practical one she gave to most people, and the house where she actually lived, which was in a neighborhood in North Atlanta where the lots were large and the houses sat back from the street behind old trees. The house was substantial, built in the 90s by someone with specific taste, bought by my mother 15 years ago, and slowly, quietly made into exactly what she wanted. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves in the study, A kitchen that had been redesigned twice. A back garden she tended herself on Saturday mornings, not because she could not hire someone, but because she liked the work. Garrett followed the navigation on his phone to an address he did not recognize. When we pulled up, he sat in the car for a moment before getting out. He looked at the house through the windshield. I watched his face. He was doing the arithmetic, the quiet involuntary accounting that happens when the physical evidence in front of you cannot be reconciled with the mental file you have been keeping. The file that said modest woman, modest circumstances, modest history. He got out of the car without saying anything. I appreciated that. There was nothing to say that would not have been worse than silence. My mother met us at the door and brought us through to the dining room where the table was set for three and something was already in the oven that smelled like the lamb dish she made for occasions she considered worth the effort. A woman named Phyllis Crane was sitting at the table when we came in. I had not known Phyllis would be there. My mother had not mentioned her. Phyllis was 45 with the composed efficiency of a person who had spent 2 decades making consequential decisions under time pressure and had developed a particular economy of movement as a result. She was a business partner of my mother's, not in the holding company itself, but in a subsidiary advisory arrangement that had been running for 8 years. She knew what my mother had built. She had worked alongside it. My mother introduced her simply. Phyllis has been my partner on several ventures over the years. She was nearby, and I asked her to join us. It was true, and it was not the whole truth, which was something my mother was very good at. Dinner was unhurried. My mother had cooked everything herself. Garrett ate with the careful appreciation of a person who is paying attention to detail in a new way, registering things he might not have registered before: the quality of the dishes, the particular choices in the room, the absence of anything that announced itself. All of it present, all of it earn, none of it requiring an audience. Phyllis talked about her work. She was easy to talk to, direct without being pointed, with the kind of professional candor that comes from not needing to impress anyone. She and my mother moved through a conversation about a supply chain project they had worked on together, and Garrett listened and asked occasional questions that were, I noticed, better questions than the ones he would have asked 2 months ago. More curious, less oriented toward demonstrating what he already knew. Then Phyllis mentioned a deal. She mentioned it the way people mention things in the middle of a broader conversation, not as a centerpiece, but as an example. She was talking about the difficulty of working with consulting firms on mid-sized accounts, about the gap between what a consulting team delivers technically and what the client actually experiences in the relationship. There was a situation 2 years ago, she said, with a supplier we were trying to integrate into one of the portfolio companies. We had brought in a consulting team to manage the transition. She did not say which consulting team. They were technically competent, she continued. Delivery was on time, documentation was clean, but afterward the supplier came to us and said the process had felt extractive. They had been handed deliverables without being asked what they needed. The consulting team had come in with a framework and applied it. Nobody had sat down with the supplier's people and asked, what is the actual problem you're trying to solve? She shook her head slightly. The supplier felt like a problem to be managed rather than a partner to be understood. They almost walked. We spent 4 months repairing the relationship after the engagement closed. She looked at my mother. I still think about that one. Good technical execution and a damaged relationship. Those things should not go together, but they do more often than anyone talks about. Garrett was very still across the table. He knew which deal she was describing. I could see it in his face, a specific quality of recognition that arrives when you hear your own work described from a perspective you had not considered, and the description is accurate. He said nothing. He did not correct her or contextualize what she was saying. He sat with it the way he had sat with the discomfort at the end of Loretta's party without reaching for an exit. Phyllis did not know he had led that account. If she connected his name to the work at any point in the evening, she did not show it. My mother, who certainly knew, did not show it either. After Phyllis left, the three of us sat with wine at the cleared table, and my mother did something I had not anticipated. Not the story I had given Garrett in abbreviated form over the years, but the real story, the version with all its dimensions intact. The sharecropper's grandchildren who had come north with a specific earned determination. The mother who worked double shifts and never complained in front of her children. The 12-year-old girl who made a decision about the equation of her life. Community college. The 4-year degree finished at night while she worked days. The decade in corporate finance where she learned everything they were willing to teach her and then learned the rest on her own. The first property, the first business, the years of building a structure that most people she knew would never see. Garrett listened the way he had not listened to anything in the 5 years I had known him. Not the listening of a person waiting for their turn to speak or performing interest for social reasons. The listening of someone who has found a subject they did not know they needed and cannot afford to miss any of it. He asked questions. The first few were logistical, the where and when of specific decisions, and then they deepened into something more genuine. He asked why she had structured the holding company the way she had, and she explained it with the patience of a teacher who was glad the student finally came. He asked about the relationships she had built along the way, about which ones had held and which ones had not, and what the difference had been. He asked about the moments when the plan had not worked and what she had done in those moments. Then he asked the question he had been building toward for the entire evening. Why did you not say anything to me? 3 years. My mother set down her wine glass. She looked at him steadily with the full attention she gave to things that deserved it. Because I wanted to see who you were without the information, she said. Knowing who I am changes how people relate to me. It always has. I wanted to see your default. She paused. And I wanted to give you time to become curious on your own. I kept thinking you would ask. About my life, my work, what I had done before you knew me. I kept leaving the door open. I am sorry I did not walk through it, he said. I know, she said. I can hear it. She was quiet for a moment. The question is what you do with the sorry. Sorry is only the starting line. Then she said something that changed the quality of the evening entirely. 8 months before Loretta's party, she said, I was reviewing the operational structure at Meridian. There was a potential restructuring and advisory position at the leadership level that I was considering creating. Someone who could bridge the gap between ownership and operations, who understood both the financial architecture and the day-to-day delivery. She looked at Garrett directly. I read the performance reviews of the senior staff. Your technical results were the strongest in your group. Consistent, measurable, real. He waited. But I also read the feedback from the smaller clients, the ones who did not have the leverage to say something directly to the firm. The pattern was the same across several accounts, technically, sound relationally invisible. People felt processed rather than engaged. She picked up her wine glass. I decided to wait, to see whether the pattern was fixed or whether it was something you were capable of learning past. He looked at her for a long moment, and now, she said, I am still watching, but I am watching something different than I was watching 8 months ago. She said it without drama, the way she said everything as a statement of fact that carried its full weight precisely because it was not dressed up in anything extra. He nodded. He did not ask what she meant by different. He understood that the answer to that question would be written by what he did rather than what he said. 2 months after the dinner, Garrett asked my mother if she would be willing to meet with him monthly. He had questions, he said, about how she thought through long-term business structure, about the decisions she had made over 25 years that had no textbook answers. He was not asking for access. He was asking for education. She agreed. The pleasure in her voice when she told me was specific and quiet. The pleasure of a person whose expertise has finally been asked for by someone she had hoped would ask. I attended 3 of those meetings. Garrett prepared for them the way he prepared for his most important professional engagements, with genuine rigor and real questions. He brought a notebook. He wrote things down. He asked follow-up questions 2 weeks after conversations to close loops he had left open. At the third meeting, he brought something unexpected. He had spent 3 weeks working on a business proposal, an opportunity for operational expansion at one of the smaller companies in the Caldwell portfolio that he had identified through the public financial documentation. He had modeled the numbers carefully. He had researched the market thoroughly. The presentation was clean and the logic was sound. My mother listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 7 questions one at a time, each one precise in the way that her questions were always precise. The questions of someone who knows exactly where the load-bearing walls are. After the 7th question, she set down her pen. "This is solid analytical work," she said. "The numbers are accurate and the structural logic is defensible." Garrett waited. He knew there was more. He had learned to wait for the more. "But you did not speak to anyone inside the company before you built this," she said. "You analyzed them from the outside." "I did not want to approach anyone without a framework." "Not having a framework is not the risk," she said. "The risk is arriving with a framework before you understand the actual problem. That is the same gap Phyllis described at dinner. Good analysis missing the human context." She looked at him without softening it. "That is your old pattern in a new form. The shape has changed. The structure underneath has not entirely." He looked at the proposal on the table. Then he looked at her. "I will go back and do it again," he said. "Not, I see what you mean. Let me explain why I approached it this way. Not that is fair. I will keep it in mind." He said he would redo the work specifically and without conditions. My mother said, "I know you will." Those 4 words in that order, with that specificity, were the most significant things she said to him in 2 years of knowing each other. Not a compliment, an expectation. An expectation from a person who has decided that a man is worth expecting things from. I sat in the corner of that room and felt something I recognized as the thing I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. Not a transformation, because people do not transform. What they do, if they are the kind of person who can, is accumulate decisions. One and then another, in the right direction consistently enough that the accumulation begins to look like something. Garrett was accumulating decisions. He had been since the Monday after the party. Each one small, each one in the right direction, each one chosen without anyone requiring it. That is not a story with a clean ending. It is a story with a direction. Loretta called me a month after the party. She had called before in the first weeks with the tentative energy of someone who wanted to say something and was not sure of her timing. When she finally called with whatever she had decided to say, her voice was settled. "Your mother," she said, "is the most extraordinary woman I have ever been related to. I have known her my whole life and I still learn things." "I know," I said. "How is Garrett?" "Learning," I said. "Good," she said. "That is the right answer." 6 weeks after the 3rd monthly meeting, I ran into Nia at a coffee place in Midtown. She handled logistics for my mother's office, scheduling communications, the practical architecture of a complicated professional life. We had met several times at family-adjacent events, and had developed the easy familiarity of two people who move in overlapping circles. She asked how I was. I asked how she was. We ordered coffee and stood at the counter waiting for it. She said as a thing she was mentioning rather than announcing, "Your mother brought up Garrett at a planning meeting last week. Not as your husband. She mentioned him in the context of the Meridian restructuring conversation, the advisory position." I looked at her. She said, Nia continued, that he was starting to ask the right questions. She picked up her coffee. "With your mother, that is the highest thing she says about anyone. I have worked for her for 7 years. She has said it about 4 people." I drove home slowly. Atlanta in the late afternoon has a particular quality of light in October and November, when the angle changes and everything goes amber and long-shadowed. I drove through it and thought about what Naya had said and did not say. I did not tell Garrett. I considered it and decided against it. Some things have more value when they are earned before they are known. If the advisory position materialized, if my mother decided that the man who had spent 3 years filing her in the wrong category had become the man she had hoped to find in him, Garrett would learn about it when it was real, not before, not from me. He was doing the work without knowing the reward was possible. That was the point. That was the only version of the work that meant anything. Thanksgiving came and he drove to pick up my mother without telling me he was going to. I found out because she called to say thank you and mentioned it. He had shown up at her door with the car, had put her bag in the trunk, and had driven her to our house with the quiet ease of a man who had decided this was something he did now. She told me later that on the drive he had asked her about the first business acquisition, the one she had made at 37 before the holding company existed. She had told him the story in full. He had asked questions throughout the telling and had not interrupted and had sat with the answers instead of using them as launching pads for his own observations. At the end, when she finished, he had said, "You built something that is going to outlast all of us." She told me she had looked out the window for a moment before answering. That, she said, was always the point. There is one last thing I want to tell you, and it is something my mother said to me on an afternoon in early December, sitting in her kitchen with 2 cups of tea and the particular quiet that settles into a house when the year is winding down and there is no urgency left in the day. She said, "The most dangerous thing a person can do is decide they already know the shape of someone, because the shape is never what you think it is. The shape is always more and different and stranger than the category you put it in. And when you discover what you missed, you are faced with a choice. You can be the kind of person who grows from that discovery, or you can be the kind who cannot." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Most people," she said, "would rather be right than grow. It is more comfortable to protect the picture you built than to admit the picture was incomplete. I have watched it happen my entire career. Smart people, talented people, people with real ability who spent that ability defending what they already believed instead of learning what they did not know." She looked at me steadily. "Garrett is not most people. He is getting there. He is not finished, but he is going." I drove home that evening in the same amber autumn light, and I thought about the man who had stood at the door of Loretta's house in October and performed attendance, and the man who had stood in the November rain and held an umbrella at the angle that kept someone else dry. Those 2 men occupied the same body. The distance between them was measured not in time but in decisions, in the accumulation of choices made after the moment when all the choices became visible and the comfortable one was no longer available. He was home when I got there. The kitchen lights were on. I could see him through the window before I opened the door, standing at the counter with a dish towel over his shoulder, reading something on his phone with the relaxed attention of a person who is at rest in the place where he is. I stood on the front step for a moment and let myself feel what I felt. Grateful is the word. Not the performance of gratitude, the kind you produce for the occasion. The real kind, which is quieter and heavier and more complicated, the kind that includes the full weight of what it almost did not become. I opened the door and went inside. He looked up when I came in. "How was she?" he asked. He meant my mother. He asked about her now specifically and by implication, the way you ask about people who have become real to you rather than people you are required to ask about. "Good," I said. "She is good." He nodded and went back to what he was reading, and I hung up my coat, and the evening continued in the ordinary, irreplaceable way that evenings continue when the people inside them have decided without announcement to keep going in the right direction. That is the whole of it. Not a story about a man who was humiliated and reformed. Not a story about a woman who was patient long enough to be vindicated. Not a story about a wife who waited for the people she loved to find each other. It is a story about a blind spot that was finally in front of 40 people in a glass of sweet tea named, and about what it means to be the kind of person who, when the wall you did not know was there turns solid in front of you, does not look for a way to pretend the wall was not real. My mother built something that is going to outlast all of us. She knew it would. That was always the point. And Garrett, who spent 3 years deciding what shape she was, is still learning the actual shape. He will be learning it for a long time. She has a great deal left to teach, and he has finally 3 years late started asking. I am grateful for that every single day.